Good evening, everyone. And we have Major Maroof Raza, who has been a well-known scholar and a media expert, strategic affairs expert. And we are going to discuss India-China relations over the last 100 years, especially last 70 and 80 years. What I'm going to start with, are a few questions for Major Raza. We all know about him. He's been a former Indian Army officer, educated in India and in the UK, and has been a media commentator on global military and security issues. And we're going to talk about, amongst the several aspects of the discussion, about his book, Contested Lands, and certain aspects of his book that really stand out. I have been I've been privileged to do a book review, a review of his book, The Contested Lands, in one of the major national dailies. And what struck me most, sir, was that Contested Lands is a book that goes into the genesis of the issue, the dispute between India and China, talks about the course of challenges, contestations, and collisions between the two countries, and also talks about possible outcomes. In a nutshell, the book traverses the entire journey of the two countries ever since they began their independent journeys in 47 and 1949, and a little bit before that, and helps us understand how the two nations have traveled. It delves into the history of territorial disputes between India and China, especially since 1949. So, why has this remained a festering core issue ever since the two countries started their journeys together?
Well, that's really the core of the arguments that I have tried to respond to in my book. But at the outset, I am delighted and privileged to be interviewed by somebody of your stature, because Probal Dasgupta, also Captain Dasgupta, is known to me partly through military history circles, partly through him and I both being China buffs, and partly because he's had a similar professional profile like me, infantry officer, and then went on to study abroad, and now, of course, a successful finance analyst, but also writes one good book after another. Most recent I was able to review was Camouflaged, which is a superb collection of short stories and real stories about heroes from India. But let me get on to addressing the question that you have raised. First, why is the border issue a festering problem? And why aren't we moving forward? Strange way, boundary issues, particularly like India, Pakistan, India, China, they become, as one minister, foreign minister told me once, there is a dispute because two sides have two different interpretation of a problem. So it's to say that my story is stronger than yours and my story is more accurate, doesn't get any takers on the other side of the hill, which is to borrow from the title of a book on India-China relations. Now, as far as China is concerned, China has a well-orchestrated long-term agenda, and that is to make sure that China's territories are all in line with the thinking of their superiors like Mao Zedong. Now, Mao said that, Tibet is like the palm of my hand, and the 5 fingers are the 5 territories we must acquire. And that really goes from Ladakh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, Arunachal. And they will slowly but steadily keep pushing you to give them that territory. Now, my one argument, which the Chinese may like to hear, is that if India insists that Ladakh and Aksai Chin is Indian territory, then how is it that since our independence, the Chinese have occupied those territories, and we've not been able to do much about it. So that's one thing that I think the Indian establishment must answer. The second issue is that how much more territory would China need to acquire to feel secure? Now, if China acquires Ladakh with push and shove, as it did in Galwan, would China then go for the other four areas, that is Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Arunachal, in the same manner? If it is going to go in that direction, then it proves to us that China has no respect for international laws and treaties. So there are two problems. And the third is that if India and China are going to continue to be at loggerheads over the definition of the boundary, and for example, one argument is that the boundary between China and India is over 4,000 kilometers. The other argument is it is just 3,488 odd kilometers. So which is correct? So I think we need to have a consolidated national approach to making a claim anywhere, that this is our claim and we're not going to budge from it. So we can't be sort of muddling along, giving wishy-washy assertions and then changing that line, because you can get away with it if you're a government in India, because the people in India can't oppose the government to that extent as they can oppose a point of view elsewhere in the world. But you can't get away with it with a party that is determined, like the Chinese, to make sure that every inch of territory that they claim they must have. And Probal, you have yourself written a superb book after we, that was after India had stood up to the Chinese, though rather belatedly in 1962. But by 1967, we were in a position to give it back to them as good as we got.
Right.
You.
Right. So no, that's absolutely. I think you're on point on all of these things. And my question, the next question is is from a brief statement that you made about the Chinese claim to territories, and I will touch upon Aksai Chin. They had made a suggestion of a swap, which is Aksai Chin for Arunachal. Now, when you talk about how much more, my question is twofold. One is, would that have, had we agreed to a swap, or had the two countries agreed, would that have meant that a settlement of some nature? Secondly, do you see that ever happening, given that you mentioned briefly that people cannot oppose government decisions very easily in either of the countries, in terms of how they view, how they make a decision, which has been very different from the earlier times if they were to change course?
Yeah, I mean, the swap proposal really came to us in the late 1950s by the then Chinese Prime Minister Chow En-lai, and this was before we went to war. So the idea was that we keep what we hold in Aksai Chin, and you keep what you hold in Arunachal Pradesh, which is then called NIFA. Now, there were 3 problems. One was Pandit Nehru was enjoying great international support for his standing, and Nehru's response, in short, was that is the border with China, that is the one in Arunachal, NIFA, that is settled. Now we need to settle the Arunachal, not the Arunachal, but the Aksai Chin issue. That settlement of the boundary has led to a lot of debate and discourse. There's a book called the McMahon Line, and the McMahon Line was, finally in frustration, marked out on a large map on a matrix quarter-inch scale, in which a thick felt pen drawn line could mean one end of the line to the other end of the line could be a kilometer or two. In the mountains, as you know, this can be quite difficult to,
Yes.
to handle for troops on the
Right.
ground. Why, is it your land or is it my land? And
Right.
what is exactly the boundary? So that's the McMahon line story, is that finally Lieutenant Colonel Sir Henry McMahon, the man who had drawn the Durand line and who was, burnt in the furnace of South Asia,
Right.
later became Foreign Secretary of the British Empire. Yeah. He just drew the line in frustration to put an end to the Shimla Conference in 1914 after about 8 sittings where they were not getting anywhere. But that was only in the Arunachal front, Bhutan to Burma. This side, nobody touched it because there was a lot of discussion and debate. Where is China's claim line and holding position vis-a-vis ours? The second thing was that in all this area of Aksai Chin, we had patrols going in, but we never physically held it and announced that this is ours. The third thing was that we were not going to give in that easily. And that was what emerged out of the swap proposal, because they said they'll keep Aksai Chin and we keep Arunachal Pradesh, and it doesn't matter. In fact, when the Galwan fiasco happened, the Chinese again suggested, what about the 1959 line? And that was the line where, on the basis of which they talked about the swap proposal. But we were silent about it. In most cases, we are silent because when somebody makes a claim like this, then we start doing our homework and pull out the maps and start studying it. What is he saying? What is he asserting?
Right.
Finally, the matter, there's an interesting anecdote which a diplomat told me, that after Nehru, there were many who were keen to settle the swap proposal with the Chinese on the basis of you keep what you keep and we keep what we keep. But a senior diplomat said in the meeting that by doing that, we'll be disloyal to the memory of Nehru. So we cannot accept that. I know these strange loyalties have led to us living with the burden for another 50, 60 years of no answer. And I've explained it in my book, as many other books have explained, that every time Indian delegations went to the Chinese, they would flash a big map to us. And before we could find out which was north and which was south, they'd close the map and put it in. They said, we've shown you our claim line.
Right.
So it's a game of deception. And as Ambassador Gokhale has written in his book, The Long Haul, that the Chinese go in for the long haul. They'll exhaust you, exasperate you, and you'll not get anywhere. So I believe, and that's the bottom line, let us settle on you keep what you keep, we keep what we keep, and proceed further. But the point at issue is China keen on a settlement? Or are we also going to go on a settlement? And people who are ill-informed in India will think that this government has done a sellout. It's not done a sellout. My counter-argument to them is, can you do any better? Then you come into the government and try and negotiate for us.
Right. That's true. And I think this is, in my understanding, it's going to continue till either of the two sides change course, and doesn't look likely at the moment. But your book, coming back to a couple of points in your book, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and here's this fine book, I don't know if one can see, but this has, I like the cover, it's gray. And it's gray because the entire relationship, the tenor of the relationship is gray. And one of the things that I very much liked reading in the book was your delving into the genesis of it, and not very many books I have found which talk about the role of Tibet and what happened from 1911 to 1950. I think that's a very, very interesting part, which could form an entirely independent book in terms of how Tibet was left alone. And of all countries, it was El Salvador which had seconded Tibet's claim to be a United Nations member when India had abandoned Tibet in favor of China. And you spoke about Jawaharlal Nehru. I think some of those foreign policy decisions left a lot to be desired during that period. However, the and you have also connected Tibet to the cause of minerals, to the cause of nuclear research that also was underway at that point of time, and the role of the then Soviet Union and China, in terms of the region where mineral deposits existed. And also China was very clear that the road to establishing a greater foreign policy influence in the region was through a military dominance, whereas India was exactly the opposite, where military assertion was not really considered in the foreign policy planning in the neighborhood. So these two divergent kind of approaches dominated the early exchanges, and also the fact that Tibet formed an important part of China's early plan in the 1940s and then 50s, especially in the 1950s. But it'd be good to hear from you about the role of Tibet, which really formed we spoke about the boundaries, the disputes, etc. And Tibet was a buffer, and that ceased to exist, which caused a whole of other can of worms to come out. So would love to hear from you about the role of Tibet in the genesis.
That itself requires a full-fledged lecture by me, because it's such a long question. But there's a need to address them in bullet points.
Yes.
The first thing I feel that Tibet was a very large and a very resource-centric region. And as you know, at least 7, if not 8 of the main rivers of Asia come from Tibet. And China's agenda increasingly now in Aksai Chin and even earlier was the waters of Tibet, because the waters helped irrigation, the waters helped creating silicon chips. Okay, so that was one issue that was driving the Chinese thinking. But more than that, at that point of time, there were quite a few things that happened. One was, the Shimla conference by Henry McMahon was essentially about defining the boundaries of Tibet, because Tibet and its northern and northern eastern side was bordering the main part of China, which we hear about all the time, Shanghai to Beijing and beyond. And Tibet on its southern and southern western side was bordering Ladakh and India. Now, the ambitions of a couple of empires crossed in Tibet. The Russian Empire was always looking to expand, and it was keen to establish its control over what we call Xinjiang, Xinjiang, and those regions nearing north of Ladakh, that is near the Taklamakan Desert, and areas which we call POK, Pakistan,
Yes.
Kashmir. So the Russians were there, but the British, who were holding forth on the Indian subcontinent, didn't want to confront the Russians head on, because the Tsar of Russia and Queen Victoria of England were cousins. So the cousins didn't want to be told that their armies were fighting each other. So there was a pushback in a way. The third thing was that Tibet in itself began to attract Chinese military incursions well before the conflict between India and China happened. And the Chinese were keen to take over Tibet. But until 1912, if my memory stands right, they used to make military forays into Tibet, but get thrashed. and the Tibetans would thrash them like hell and send the Chinese forces back southwards. So they'd go back to China via Calcutta and by ship. That's another footnote in history which we don't often talk about. Then the Chinese, when they became a little more stronger, because Mao went to Russia for a 2-month visit, and he was actually kept in seclusion and by the Russian leadership, which told him that we will not give you the weapon systems that you asked for unless China becomes a full-fledged lackey of the Russians. And this eventually happened in the Korean War. The Chinese were provided aircrafts by Russian military leadership and other technologies to make sure that the Chinese were able to confront, along with North Korea, the American forces. And they did give the Americans quite a time. Now, the statement by Mao in the Korean War that he couldn't be bothered about the losses of soldiers and lives, he wanted to confront the Americans. This won the Russians over. And the Russians said, okay, fine, we'll do a deal with you, but you will continue to produce nuclear weapons after we have established Russia as the #2 country in the nuclear arms race. So north of Kashmir is where the Russians did their first test in 1949 at a place called Semipalatinsk. And after that, the Russians were content that they'd beaten the British to the race. But the British were establishing monitoring stations in what we call POK, Gilgit-Baltistan, and those areas. In fact, that was part of the British agenda to make sure that Kashmir doesn't come fully into India and remains an autonomous region under British control and influence, because they wanted to monitor to what extent Russia wants to go further with its nuclear plans. Uranium was being excavated in the area of Aksai Chin and used to be transported to Semipalatinsk, where nuclear weapon systems were being worked at. Now, India, the Delhi government, it is not India as we see India today,
Right.
the British government in India were quite blissfully unaware of the agenda of the Russians and the Chinese. But the Russians continued to support the Chinese. And well before the 1962 conflict, aerial reconnaissance missions by an Indian Air Force officer, Wing Commander Jaggi Nath, who recently passed away. He was Mahavir Chakra and Bar. And he did exceptional things before the 62 war and again in the 65 war. Brave man. I've had the privilege of speaking to him on the phone. Couldn't meet him. And he took photographs of the Chinese nuclear facilities north of Nepal along the India-China border. These photographs used to reach Delhi. From Delhi, because of a British intelligence arrangement with Indian intelligence, these would go to America and the UK. In the UK, the head of British intelligence was a person called Kim Philby, who became later infamous as the head of MI6, who defected into Russia. Philby would pass the information on to the Russians that India has been picking up photographs of Chinese nuclear facility. And the Chinese in turn were alerted that India is getting to grips with the Chinese nuclear program. So therefore, one of the initiatives on the Mao government to attack India was to put the fear of God into India, that don't probe too close to us. The other 2-3 issues were, one was India's ongoing linkages with the US, which led to the Dalai Lama fleeing into India. Also, another thing that worried the Chinese or angered the Chinese were the Indian support to the Tibetan cause and militarization of Tibet through the CIA via India into Lhasa elsewhere. So all that led to a situation. Now, finally, the one point that I wish to make is that, you see, the Chinese didn't want their agenda to achieve greatness to be disrupted. So part of Mao's deal with Khrushchev was that you give me the wherewithal to become a nuclear weapon state, then I become your strong arm in world affairs as another communist state. So those things were happening all together. Now, Pandit Nehru was in blissful ignorance. Firstly, the Panchsheel Treaty says the treaty is between India, China, and Tibet, a region of China. So by the treaty of 54, we acknowledged that Tibet was a part of China. Second thing was, Nehru kept being alerted by various people that the Chinese have a much bigger agenda. But Nehru would not be willing to listen that the Chinese cannot be trusted. And he kept trusting the Chinese till when the attacks came, they labeled it the Great Betrayal. When was there a promise by the Chinese that they would not betray us? The Chinese would betray their own fathers and mothers if it's for the cause of the party and the Communist Party. So there was that issue. And then finally, the Chinese saw India as a lackey of the West, especially Britain and America, and wanted the West's encroachment to stop. So the photographs that were taken by Wing Commander Chattinar, the Chinese were scared that America would do some air raids on Chinese facilities on what is Lopnor and destroy China's hard-earned status of power, kind of support from the Russians. And all that led to the Chinese hitting India hard. And apparently Mao said that he wanted to teach India a lesson. He actually wanted to teach India that India should not interfere with China's affairs. So broadly, these are the issues. I mean, I can go on and on.
Yes, of course. But you spoke briefly about the leadership, and the leadership was missing in the sense that the leadership at war was missing. The leadership in terms of understanding China's long-term plan was missing. China had started the 100 years plan in 1949 once the new China was formed, but India was in blissful ignorance at that time. My next question is about 1962 and post 1962. Things started to change. Now we have, there was the issue of understanding China pre 1962. We got a jolt in 1962. There was the conflict, the setbacks. How do you look at 1962? If I were to flip the question in terms of seeing 1962 as a precursor to changes that happened, did the the leadership that followed and the transformative period from 62 to 71 change the equation between India and China in certain respects?
Yeah, the point we need to understand that the Indian government, Nehru was such a giant politically within India that nobody could stand up to him, at least for a long time. Apparently, I was told by somebody who was a staff officer to Morarji Desai. So Pandit Nehru once, in an argument with his cabinet ministers, said that, if I'm not there, what will you all do? So I'm paraphrasing, but Morarji Bhai said, Panditji, don't be so sure. We are all there. We can handle it. So Nehru was for a long time unopposed. And therefore, his view was that China will not attack us. There will be no conflict with China. And this view was fed by two of his closest associates. One was Mr. Bholanath Malik, the head of intelligence, for much of Nehru's tenure till Panditji died, and he was national security advisor and whatever else. In a way, like Mr. Doval is to Prime Minister Modi, right? The second was Pandit Nehru had some important appointments that were given to people who would say things that Nehru wanted them to, like Krishna Menon, for example.
Right.
He, I believe, was one of the worst defense ministers India has had. And it's not good to criticize a man who can't counter your criticism. But I was too small, a little boy in 62 to be able to stand up or know at least what is the difference between Nepal and Bhutan. But Krishna Menon was another person who kept taking Nehru and his government on and was said to have said to various people that China, we don't need to fight them. I'll fight them at the UN and bring them to heel. Now, that none of that happened. And when things went out of control, Krishna Menon resigned in November, I think, 1962.
62, yes.
Yeah. So what happens is that the story of India-China, this kind of individualistic approach to India's security led to further confusion on the ground. None of the senior military commanders were willing to listen to the inputs of the men on the ground. As also, none of the senior military commanders, barring aside one or two of them, knew their bloody nuts and bolts. You know, you had General B.G. Kaul, who was a favorite of the Nehru, and Nehru thought he was grooming him to become chief. And B.G. Kaul was an absolute clown. And he made a mess out of India's deployment on NIFA. Whereas the other military commanders in Ladakh, General Bikram Singh and General Daulat Singh, knew their beans, and we didn't lose much territory in Ladakh.
Yes. Right.
We were just in retreat in NIFA because our military commanders were just following uninformed logic, and they were doing what was being told to them by some of Nehru's cronies in army headquarters, like General P.N. Thapar, who was later, who cried and was also who resigned when 62 finished. But it was a debacle in the making. I've tried to study it, and I've brought out various actions in Ladakh and Aksai Chin. And anybody looking at it will say, we were asking to be hammered.
Right. So, this happened in 62, and the events that followed, we saw large-scale changes. The resignations, as you spoke about, of the army chief, of the defense minister, Pandit Nehru passed away. So lots of changes happened. And the transformative changes led to a different equation between the next defense minister, Mr. Y.B. Chavan, and the military establishment. We also saw 1967, Nathula and Chola. And then after that, 20 years later in Sondarungshu, when the Chinese were pushed back, there was a standoff in which India had the better of the exchanges. And then in 2017 in Doklam, each of these times, we saw the autonomy of the leadership on ground of the military leaders prevail. And then, when you say the battlefield decisions are best left to generals because they are in a better state to handle affairs on ground, which then pave the way for discussions to take place, though we must understand the inflection points when political overtures must supersede military actions. However, 67, 87, 2017, military leadership, the autonomous military leadership underscored, the victories were underscored by,
the point you're making.
Yeah.
I made that point also in my book. See, the point is that at every stage you needed strong and firm military commanders. In 67, you had General Sagat, whose biography later says, what was it? A man of war or something like that.
Talent for War.
Yeah.
The Talent for War by General Ranveer Singh.
Has written that.
Yes.
And he did that. He did it in the Go operations. He later showed his mettle in the liberation of Dhaka. So he is an outstanding man, but he also had two others in the hierarchy above him, including Sam Manekshaw, who gave him the green signal that go ahead and do what you want and cut off the bloody telephone lines to Delhi. So he cut it off and didn't want to be harassed. Now, he killed more Chinese, near some 381 to 400 Chinese, and gave them a message that this is not the army of 62. And 62 also we would have done well. In fact, I've always studied this with the intention that here was an army that did so well between 1914 and till date. And why is it we floundered in 62? We floundered because of absence of political leadership and absence of understanding at the political leadership level. And all generals who had sold their damn souls in the hope that they'll become not just 3-star, but 4-star and 5-star generals, so that their bosses would be pleased with them. And they went around crawling in front of the political leadership. In 87, General Sundarji, who I had the privilege of meeting quite a few times, and he told me things about Sundarangchu, which I don't want to say here, but the bottom line is that when the Chinese began circling Sundarangchu, which is somewhere near Nathula and Namkachu, he ordered troops to be heli-lifted and surround the Chinese. So, which Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi told him, what have you done, General? He said, Prime Minister, I've done what is my mandated job by the Cabinet Committee. Now you please do what is your job. And while they was pondering what to do, the Chinese, good for them, withdrew. So the matter settled without much embarrassment. And then you had Doklam, where the co-commander was my course mate. And he's a good chap professionally, but his orders are very clear, don't budge. And he did not budge. So the Chinese, they always probe you to see how far they can go into your territory. And if you don't give in, they go back. This is what they did in a similar way in Galwan. And you hit back, they quietened, went back, they built up a lot of arms deployment, and so did we. So we've got another tense frontier there. So that is the thing, that we've learned our lessons with the Chinese after our confrontation, that don't push us too hard. We are not an army that doesn't know what it's doing. We need political approval. As you mentioned, that generals are best left to do the fighting. And as the British Prime Minister Clemenceau had said, that war is too serious a business to be left to generals. But I wrote after 26/11 that dealing with Pakistan is too serious a business to be left to politicians.
Right. Well said, sir. I think it's also been one of the major points of these decisions, of the events of 67, the conflicts of the battles of 67, and the standoff of 86-87 in Somdurungchu, as Taylor Fravel puts it, that they added to a declining claim strength of China. For instance, that sort of helped decline. It caused a decline in China's bargaining power in territorial disputes, so that they have been happening, and especially in the last 10, 12 years under Xi Jinping. But overall, they have also resulted in a declining claim strength. So China has always wanted to usurp land, but they, like you rightly said, they also understand that India is no more a pushover. And these instances, the watershed battles of 67 and 87, really define how the relations have moved to the last few years. So my question,
very true.
Sir,
The point is that the Chinese they went into Vietnam to try and teach them a lesson, and they learned a lesson or two. So the thing is that the Chinese are constantly hedging their bets and hoping they can browbeat people to fall in line. But therefore, China has come up with a strategy of fighting its adversaries like India through unconventional methods, through cyber attacks, through financial attacks on your system, through using viruses like COVID to cripple society. So
Right.
the military dimension with China is just a front.
Right.
The actual damage Chinese will do to you is through unconventional methods.
Right. My last question, therefore, going into the future, do you see the India-China confrontation, it rests on three pegs, the confrontation, conflict, and cooperation, more so defined by confrontation. So the confrontation would be, defined more by, how much each has influence in the neighborhood, in the areas around. I call it a war of influence, which is what we are seeing happen in Maldives, which is what we are seeing happen in Nepal and Sri Lanka, and perhaps in Bangladesh. So, if I may put it this way, it's a kind of a surrogate war that India and China would go into, given that they can no more afford a direct war, and you rightly said this indirect, different dimensions of war would come into play. Do you see a war of influence is something that we're going to see more?
Exactly. I mean, my latest book, which is a collection of essays, there is a whole section on China in which I try to explain to people that what China would be doing to achieve its aim. And China's aim is world domination, in which we are not the number one target, but we are an impediment on the way. And when China, for example, tries to dominate Taiwan and gets blocked there by the Americans, it will quickly shift its attention to the India-China border. Xi Jinping has to deliver, has to give results. And when you build up ambitions and hype that hum kisi se kam nahi, then you will have problems. And that applies to the New Delhi government also, which does muscle flexing. And when Aksai Chin intrusions happened, I wrote a piece, 1962 Deja Vu. So they are testing the waters. They're not happy with your relationship with America. They're not happy with your moving in and trying to buttress the ambitions of the neighbors. But we are not doing enough. We are not doing the right thing. It's not in our nature to be confrontational. And therefore, we are 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yes. So, this is great, and thank you very much, sir, for your views on the India-China issue, the history, the dispute, the course, and such a wonderful conversation, wherein in the last 30 minutes you've encapsulated the past, the present, and the future. And I would summarize by saying that the more you look at the future and the present, it is equally apt, therefore, to look at the past in order to understand the future. History tells us how we go forward. And in order to understand the India-China course of collision, competition, and conflict, we must understand how we have gone in the last 100 years or so. Thank you very much. Sir, your last point.
As Captain Sir Basil Littlehart, who was the captain who taught generals as per Moshe Dayan, had said that if you want peace, understand wars.
Yes. Thank you very much.
All the best.
Thank you.